All right. Sorry for the delay. I had a little bit of a mic problem, but we're good to go. So welcome. I hope you had a good holiday weekend and are ready to get back to work. I don't think I really have any announcement. Oh yeah, there was an announcement on Slack if you didn't see it about the date for graduation. It had to be moved due to a scheduling issue. So if you saw it, hopefully that won't be a problem for you. If you didn't see it, please hop on Slack. Ryan posted it, I think, just yesterday. So please hop on Slack real quick. Take a look at that message. Make sure that you hopefully are still able to attend, and let us know if there's anything we can do to help you out with that. Just want to make sure you're aware. Yeah, I don't think I have any other announcements right now. So let's go ahead and talk about objects. We're going to take a break from spring for this week. We'll get back to spring very soon. But we're going to take a break from spring for now and talk about object-oriented programming for a little bit. So let's start with some review about Java objects, and we can think about Python objects too a little bit because that might help our understanding of Java objects. What does a class contain? This is true for Java and Python. What does a class contain? I'm sorry? Fields? Yeah, what else? Methods? That's about it, right? Everything's going to fall into one of those two categories. It's either going to be a field or it's going to be a method. There are specialized kinds of fields and methods, right? So like a constructor, for example, is a method that most, if not all classes are going to have, but that's just a special method. So everything's going to fall into one of those two categories, fields and methods. What is this? When you see the word this, what is that referring to? Yeah.
For me, it reminded me of self.
Yes.
Self-God.
Yeah, self. It's the exact same idea. Yep. This is Java's version of self. They are meant to do exactly the same thing. So if you understand how self works in Python, just take that knowledge and apply it to this in Java, and you should be good to go on that front. So just as a recap, can we be a little bit more explicit about what this and self are doing? It's a reference to the instance of the class, the object, right? So in order for me to use a class, I have to create instances of objects, and within my class, I can use this to refer to the instance of the object that is being currently accessed, currently used. All right, good. What are some examples of access modifiers? Private and public. Those are the two big ones. Protected. So we're going to see protected next week, but that is another example of an access modifier. Let's stick with public and private for now. We'll talk about protected next week. What does it mean? So if I mark something public, right? I think that one's the more obvious of the two. If I mark something public, that means that anything can access it. It's open. It's out there for the world. Yeah.
So by access, do you mean use it or do you mean change it? Or both?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah. So I can read it and I can write to it. Yeah, both. If I mark something as public, it is out there for the world to do whatever it wants to those values. If I mark something as private, who can use it? The class. The members of the class. Yeah. Members of the class itself, and only the members of the class itself, right? That's it. So why? Why might I mark things as private? Security, sure. Security, not just security in the traditional sense. So when people say the word security, they think locking up your valuables, right? Protecting them from people trying to hack you or steal your stuff. But not just that kind of security, but other kinds of security too. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of like why we use NBC and the whole like separation of concerns. Like when you know where the concern is located, when you know it's just in one spot, you fix it, and then wherever that method is or field is being used to the program and stuff.
Yeah.
Like you know it's going to be good, and it's kind of just random. scattered all over the place.
And that's a great point that you just brought up, the separation of concerns, the idea of keeping things as narrowly focused as you possibly can, right? So the other kind of security to be worried about is security from like yourself, right? So that you don't come in and blow something away or screw something up on accident, right? Or other programmers even, right? Other programmers who might be using your code, you want to restrict their access to the important stuff so that they don't come in and change something or do something that they're not supposed to be doing in a strange context. So that's why we have the private modifier. What kinds of things should we be marking as private? Fields. Which ones? All of them. Yeah, all of them. I'm a big stickler on this. I can't tell you the last time I wrote a public field. It's been, I mean, hopefully never, but that's probably not true. I've probably done it at some point in my life, but it's been a very long time, and I don't plan on changing that anytime soon. Fields should always be marked private. Why? How do I get access to fields if they're always marked private? Getters and setters. Getters and setters. Yeah, exactly. So if I have a field with getters and setters, what does that turn into? It goes into a cocoon and comes out a butterfly called, not a field, but it's on the slide. A property. A property. A property. A property is a field that has getters and setters. That is what a property is, right? That is what a property is. You might hear a field referred to as a backing field sometimes, meaning that I have a property and there's a backing field that, is what actually does all the work behind the scenes to make that property work. So yeah, we answered that was on my list of things to talk to you about, the difference between a field and a property. They actually work together. You can't have a property without a field, really. Actually, technically you can, but it's pretty rare to see. Cool. Anything else that I might mark private besides fields? Some methods. So it's possible that I can mark methods private as well, right? And the prep work gave some examples of when you might want to do that. Like what? Some of the methods that we just talked about are commonly marked as private. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure. Sure. Yeah, you shouldn't have to change it, but I think we have another tool to accommodate that, right? If there's a value that I really know I don't want to change, how can I enforce that? Final. Yeah, I can mark something as final. So that was something later on in my list, right, to talk to you about. I can mark things as final, which means as soon as they get a value, that's what they have forever. They cannot be changed after that. So in the student ID example, you're exactly right. If we're talking about a setter for a student ID, instead of making a setter and marking it private, probably better to just not have one in that case. I'm not obligated to have a setter. I'm not obligated to even have a getter for a field, right? If there's no reason to provide access to that field outside of the class, then I don't have to give you a getter or a setter. It's not required of me to do so. So you should think about that as well, not just whether the getters and setters should be public or private, but whether you should even have them at all should be something that crosses your mind as you're designing your class. But I think the subject of setters is a common target for private methods. Oftentimes we don't mind if people read our values, but we don't really want them to change our values. We don't really want to allow them to modify those values. We want to keep that a little bit more restricted. Not always, but sometimes. And so that could be an example of a private method. Basically any method that you don't expect somebody to need to have to use outside of the class, right? Go ahead and mark it private. And the general rule of security, and this falls kind of in the realm of security, right, is keep things as restricted as possible. So really you should be trying to mark things as private unless you can justify a reason to mark them as public. If you have things marked as private, people probably aren't going to question you on that. They're going to think that you're being very secure and very careful about how you are letting people access the code in your class. If you start marking everything as public, people are going to start raising their eyebrows and be like, whoa, this person's just letting it all hang out, right? Why are they doing that? What's going on? So it's much better to try and keep things marked private and provide justification to mark them as public than the other way around. That's the point I'm trying to make there. We skipped a question here. What is encapsulation? It's a very important idea. This is actually a classic interview question as well. What is encapsulation? Yeah, go ahead.
Kind of goes off of why we talked about private and public. You want your classes, and you don't want them all big to me.
Right. So I want my classes to be focused, right? I want them to be focused on. I want them to represent an object. I want them to represent an object that I could talk about in the real world, even, right? Something that I could discuss outside of the realm of computer science, perhaps. And so we actually talked about this when we talked about objects back in Python. If you're using good encapsulation, there's a couple of relationships between objects and the fields that they have and objects and the methods that they have. I'm sure you remember me talking about this. It's a good time to refresh our memories. What's the relationship between an object and a field? Has a, right? So if I'm talking about a student has a name, student has a ID number, right? I should be able to say that sentence and have it make sense. If I can say that sentence and it makes sense, that means I'm using good encapsulation. That means that field is in the right place. If I say that and it doesn't make sense, then it's either not a field or it is a field, but it's just not a field that belongs in this particular object. Maybe it belongs in a different object, perhaps. And so the relationship then between a class and the methods, can do, right? Can perform. So methods are always going to be actions, verbs, behaviors that an object can perform. And so I should be able to do the same thing with those. I should be able to use that in a sentence. A student can register for a class. A student can, I don't know, drop out of school. Don't do that. Well, if you want to. We talked about this a little bit when it comes to methods, but we can talk about it as it relates to fields as well. This idea of static versus non-static things. We're using a lot more non-static methods now. We're also using non-static fields. So just as a little recap, what does it mean, or how does a static field different from a non-static field? Could somebody explain that to me?
Belongs to the class, not the instance. So it's a static field ID. That ID number is shared by every single instance.
Exactly, yeah. So static fields are going to be able to be seen by every single, the value is going to be able to be seen by every single instance of the class. The first thing you said is the textbook definition of static versus non-static. Static is it's owned by the class, not the instances of the class. Non-static fields are owned by the instances of the class. So if I have a non-static value called name, that means that every single instance of the student object is going to have its own unique name variable. If I have a static variable for IDs, which there was in the prep work, that means that there's one value for IDs that every single instance of the student class is going to share. And the reason that we did that is why? Why did we do that? Why is that useful? What was that static field accomplishing for us? Anybody remember?
To increase each ID number by 1.
So I wanted to increase each ID number by 1 every time I created a new student, and that ensures that it's unique. I'm not going to give the same ID number to the two different students.
Basically, then the primary key.
Eventually, when we talk about persistence in Java, it could become the primary key, yes. But we don't have a database right now. But thinking about it like a primary key is not incorrect. Yeah. So that's one use of a static value, not the only use of a static value, but certainly one use of a static value. Another use of a static value is for a true constant. So if I look we've talked about the math library and all the things that it can do. Pi, right, is a number, very famous number. It's not going to change. It is what it is. It is, in that class, it is marked as not just static, but also final. Everybody can see it, and it's not going to change. It is constant forever and ever and ever. So that's another time where you might see things marked as static and final, as if they're environmental constants like that.
Would you commonly see those as public figures?
Probably.
I've used a lot of situations where I want to get access to those.
Probably, yeah. That's probably the one reasonable exception to marking fields as private, is if they are true constants that need to be accessed, frequently. Because you're right, there is no getPi method that I know of. I guess it could be in there somewhere, but I haven't seen it. We just access the value directly. Cool. Any other, I think we covered everything. Any other questions on some of the object-oriented stuff? Yeah, what's up?
I wanted to ask about final.
Okay.
Is it really used that often?
Sure, absolutely. It's used for values that I strongly suspect are not going to change, or if I want to be more firm about it, values that I do not want to change. There's absolutely cannot change. So one thing that you might consider used for is the student ID in the student class. I can't remember if the prep work did that or not, but once I give you a student ID value, I really don't want to change it, because changing somebody's student ID value would have nasty effects on how I track that person in the system. So you often see it used in contexts like that. It's not the only one, though. But yeah, it is used. It's not like you're not going to use it every single day of your life necessarily, but not uncommon to see things marked as final. Great question. Any other questions I can answer before we do a little practice problem with some classes? So I want to take a look at one of the exercises from the prep. We've been talking about that student class a lot. And one of the prep exercises has you thinking, that's the studio, that's not what I meant to do, has you design a course class. And I know at least a couple people asked about this on the Slack. Sorry, I don't know why my brain couldn't connect that dot. Let's talk about how we might consider designing a course class. Now, we are mostly going to stick with the fields for now, because I believe we're going to be talking about methods in more detail on Monday. Let me just double check that real quick and make sure that I'm remembering that properly. What is the prep for Monday, real quick? Yeah, behavior methods. So we're really just interested in fields today, not necessarily methods. We're going to talk about methods more on Monday. But that's okay. It's still a good exercise. So you can see that I've actually already copied over the student code. This is code that I copied directly from the prep work. I didn't do anything fancy. The one thing that I did do, and we can have a discussion about this real quick as well, is I came down here and I added getters and setters for all of the fields except for this one. I did not add a getter and setter for this one. Do you guys feel okay about that? What if I told you they're all marked as public as well? Does that make you feel any better or worse about it?
What's the final for again?
What is the final for? Yeah, so I see the word final shows up here. Final in student ID, so that means that once I've set your student ID, that value cannot change. That is your ID for life. Yep. There are surprisingly few things. I mean, there are things that people think might be. You have to be careful with this, right? There are things that people think might be marked as final, but actually probably shouldn't be marked as final. So, an equivalent of a student ID, or kind of close to a student ID, is your social security number, right? In fact, when I first started going to school 15 or so years ago, my student ID was my social security number, which is, you know, kind of crazy thing to say these days, right? But that's what it was. And you might think that, all right, I get assigned a social security number and that's my social security number for life, right? Until somebody steals it and then they have to give you a new one. So you think that social security numbers are stable, but actually there are cases when they're not. So you do have to be careful with that final keyword. You want to be absolutely sure that that value is not going to change, because if it turns out later on down the road that it does have to change, then you're in a little bit of trouble. So let's talk about these getters and setters. I actually have these getters and setters for the remaining fields: name, student ID, number of credits, and GPA. Are we okay with that? Having all these marked public? Yes? So anybody should be able to pick up a student object and just change their GPA?
Or the number of credits.
Oh, that's get GPA, but I have a set GPA, yeah. Or set number of credits, too, yeah. You like that one? You want to keep it? Well, you're never going to get hired over at WashU. That's out of the cards for you, I'm afraid. These are pretty dangerous. If I have them at all, so that's a question that you should ask. Should I have this at all, right? How do I change somebody's GPA? If I'm updating somebody's GPA, what does that mean? That means they took a class and they got a grade in that class. And there's actually a formula, which I'm not going to get into right now, that they use to actually take, you know, your letter grade and turn it into a GPA and recompute it. So even if I was going to set somebody or change somebody's GPA, this is probably not the way to do it properly. I'd have to do some arithmetic, do some math, keep track of all their past grades, things like that. And even then, right, do I want this to be public? Probably not. Probably not. So you need to be a little bit careful about that. You know, again, I'm saying these things, and I'm making fun of, you know, people who are disagreeing with me, but actually it is subjective. It very much is subjective. And if you think I'm wrong, you are entirely entitled to that opinion. You can go start your own university and do it your way. I'm not going to stop you. Right? But these are the kinds of questions that we need to think about when we're doing these things. Here's another one that I kind of have an issue with, right? Students, I guess people can change their names. That is a thing that can happen.
Yeah.
So perhaps that one's okay. Perhaps that one's all right after all.
Although just not anybody.
Yeah, maybe mark it as private. Sure. Sure. Okay. So now that we've kind of got that out of the way, let's think about a course. Let's think about, yeah, go ahead.
You need for the settings, you need to say this name.
Good question. Do we need to say this name? We do not have to, but I actually think that it's a good habit to get into using this in front of your fields. The reason I say that is because sometimes it can be ambiguous. I can actually have multiple variables with the same variable name, and so that can be a little bit ambiguous. IntelliJ tries to help you out, right? If it thinks you're talking about a field, which it does here, it's gonna mark it in purple. So that's how you know that IntelliJ thinks you're talking about a field. But if I see the word this in front of it, I know clear as day that this is referring to a field, right? And not some other random variable. Was there a question in the back? Yeah. Right, so this statement looks a little odd, right? But it makes sense. This name refers to the field, whereas the variable here called name is referring to the parameter. And actually, if I take this name off, now we've got a problem. Now I've got a problem. So IntelliJ, or Java rather, is a more appropriate way of saying it, is going to, if variable name is ambiguous, it's going to pick the closest one that it can find, which in this case is the parameter, not the field. The field is much farther away. It's at the class level. So I need to be explicit. In this case, it is not optional. In other cases, it is. Yeah?
size of this company, should in the parameters say a name?
That is one naming convention that exists. And the reason that my getters and setters look a little bit different than the prep work is actually because of a shortcut that I took, and I'm going to show you that shortcut a little bit later. Yeah. So a naming convention is just that. It's a convention. It's like it's a suggestion. Whether it might not even be that strong of a suggestion, right? How much do you bow to peer pressure? I don't know. In high school, I did quite a lot, but not so much anymore, right? So whether you actually make that choice or not is kind of up to you. You might make some people upset if you don't follow the convention. You might not, depending on the convention. So Java is not going to care one way or the other. Java has no opinions on your variable names at all, as long as your code works. So I wanted to talk to you about the design of the course class. So, if you did the exercise where you put the student class in here, you can follow along with me. If not, just sit back, relax, and enjoy the show while we design a course class real quick. So I'm going to create a class called course. Nope. And so we've done exercises like this before in the past, right? Where we've come up with the hasas for an object. And that's what I want to do for my course class. I want to come up with at least a few. I don't know that we need a huge, long list of things, but what are some things that I would expect a course to have?
A course name.
A name?
A course code.
Code or a number, right? Like a course number, like CompSci 101, right? LC101 is a course number. A description? A time, so a meeting time. Date. A semester. I think those two are separate, right?
Number of hours.
Number of credits, yeah, number of credits. A roster, good. All right, so an instructor, or perhaps multiple instructors, depending on the course, right? Anything else? I'm sorry? Grades. So who actually has the grades? Course has grades. Students have grades. I think they both sound kind of reasonable, right? So that one I feel like could go either way, and really depends on ultimately what you want to do with those grades. I think you could make a case for having a grade book here, and we've actually developed similar things to that in prior exercises, I believe.
So it could also be like a type of grade, is it pass, fail versus A, B, C, D, F?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. There's one other important one that I deal with on a regular basis that I'm thinking about, which is, I'd call it like the number of seats. Like how many people am I going to allow to enroll? What's the maximum capacity, right? Because I only have a limited number of space for people. Yeah. Prerequisites, yeah, good one. Prerequisites. And a place, location. Cool. This is a huge list. We are not going to do all of these, although we can continue doing the exercise for all of these, right? The next thing that I would do is think of data types for these. So we can run down the list and think of data types for all of these. So the data type for a name is probably going to be string. The number is going to be string, even though it's called number, right? It's actually a string because there's letters involved. Description is probably going to be a string. This is going to be, you could argue string. There's actually a date class in Java that could work.
Okay.
That could work. But you could argue for it to be a string if you didn't want to mess with the date class. Semester, string. Credits. I heard int. Depends, right? Depends on the institution. You could have half credits or even fractional credits if you wanted to. I think double is extra safe, but depending on the institution, you might be able to get away with ints. If you know for a fact you're not going to have to worry about fractional credits. The roster. This is the trickiest one, I think. But the prep work sort of alluded to it. I heard somebody just say it. Array list. Array list of what? Students. We have a student class. That's what you saw in the prep work. Actually, we just saw it up on the screen a minute ago, right? I can make an array list that contains student objects. And I think that is an appropriate data type for the course roster. When I see people approach this problem, a common answer that I get might be an array list of strings instead. And the reasoning behind this is, well, what's a roster? I mean, it's kind of a list of names, right? And if that's all you really care about, then this will get you there. But if I do this, I'm missing out on a lot of potential opportunity to use the code that I've got in my student class, right? What if I want to get the ID numbers of all of my students? If I just have an array list of names, I can't do that very easily. But if I have an array list of student objects, then I can go through that roster and ask each one, hey, what's your ID number? Please tell me what your ID number is, right? That's one of the nice things about encapsulation, about designing your own classes. I think I've mentioned this before when we were talking about it in Python, but when you create a class, you're really creating a data type. You're creating a brand new data type. So anywhere that you would normally expect to see a data type, you can use the name of your class in its place if it's appropriate for you to do so. And this is one such case. So I could also use student as the data type for a variable or a method parameter, right? Or a method return type or something along those lines. Those are all okay things to do. Cool. Instructor. What should that be? So string, that would be, again, implying the instructor's name. Now we don't have one, but could you envision what an instructor class would look like? Right? Information about the instructor, like what classes they're teaching, right? How long they've been there, where their office is, yeah, how to call them. An array list of instructors, if there's more than one, which happens, right? You better believe that when I'm teaching the introductory to comp sci class in the fall with 500 students, that I'm not doing it by myself. So yeah, absolutely.
You said 500 students in one class?
500 students in one semester, yeah, coming up this fall.
But I mean in one class or multiple classes?
They're all taking the intro class at the same time.
Okay,
Yeah.
in the same place. Okay. I didn't know there was an auditorium that big, the whole place.
Well, we're in the computer labs, so they're in smaller groups of about 30 per lab that meet from 11:30 in the morning until 5 or 5:30 in the evening, twice a week. Yeah, it's a lot of fun actually, but it is draining for sure. I sleep very well on those nights. Grades. A hash map, I'm glad you said that. Yeah, a hash map. But when I say hash map, I have to be more specific. Hash map of what? Student's name. Could be a double if we're talking about GPA, or int if we're talking about GPA, or if I'm talking about letter grades, could be a string. But I heard somebody say something else over here, right?
It's thinking of something, like you got an 80 on this, you got a 90 on that.
Oh, okay. You got 80 on, so
the student, and then it's part of this,
so you're thinking about grades as like a grade book, right? Like
right, that's what I'm
you got this grade on this assignment, this grade on this assignment.
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, for sure. So that could be a double or an int, but then is a hash map enough to do that? An array list of hash maps. Yeah, we're getting crazy now, but yeah.
Yeah, because that would put on.
An array list of hash maps where I have one hash map for each assignment, right? One hash map for each assignment. All right, we can do that. And so then the hash map, the string represents the student, but I heard somebody mention we have the same thing as before, right? Couldn't I use a student object there? And would it benefit me to do so, I guess, is the question. I don't see the harm. I certainly don't see the harm in using the student class as the keys there. Would allow me to do stuff like look up a student by their ID and their name if I wanted to, right? Not just the name. Yeah, that was a good one. Number of seats. Int, yeah, because I don't have any half people taking my classes that I know of. Prerequisites. How many prerequisites are there going to be?
Could be multiple.
Could be multiple, right?
And couldn't that be out of the public class course? Because there would be other courses.
Yeah, there would be other courses, that's right. So this could be an array list of course objects. Exactly. Yeah. We want to use these types. We're making these types for a reason, right? We want to use them when it's appropriate to do so. Location. String, sure. Perfect. All right. That was a fun little exercise. We're not quite done yet. I want to do a few final things. I want to make the fields, right? We're not going to make fields for all of these. I'm going to pick a few of the more important ones and mark them with a star. So I think we need a name and a number and a roster probably, right? I think we'll just do those three. I know it's a very, very big simplification of what we've got. If that bothers you, then put some more in. I'm not going to stop you. Go nuts. But for the sake of time, we're going to do those three. So let's do that next. I've got three, and so now that we've done the design, right, actually writing the code should be very straightforward, right? I want to make names, so the first thing I'm going to type is private. I'm making a field. First word's always going to be private. Next thing is going to be string, because that's what we decided it's going to be, and then name. All right. Do I need to mark this as static or final, do you think? No.
No, because course names can possibly.
Course names can change. Yep, it's possible.
But they would be the same number.
All right, so let's do number next. Private. Do I need static or final for the number? Is a course number? That can change too. I've seen it happen. Yep.
Yeah.
So number. Okay. And then the roster. Private. Do I need static or final? What would happen if I marked it static? You said no, and I agree with you, but what would happen if I marked it as static? Every course would have the same roster. That sounds pretty ridiculous, right? That's not how things work. So it definitely shouldn't be static.
It can't be final because the array of the roster changes.
Now, final, as it relates to array lists, is a little bit different. I'm glad you brought that up. Because when I mark an object as final, that doesn't mean that I can't change the object. So if I mark this array list as final, I can still add things to it, take things out of the array list. It's not going to stop me from doing that. It's going to stop me from making a brand new array list and swapping that array list out for a totally different list. That's what final would prevent me from doing, but it's not going to prevent me from manipulating this list if I want to, right? So with that in mind, marking this as final is not necessarily a bad thing. I don't know if it's completely necessary either, though. I don't think it would stop us from doing what we want to do, but I also don't know that it's entirely necessary for us to mark it as final. And so I need to import array list to make that work. All right, cool. Next thing to do is probably create a constructor. So how do I create a constructor? What's the first thing I need to type? I'm sorry? Public. Can constructors be private? They could be private, though. They could. There's nothing stopping me from marking them as private, and it does happen sometimes. Sometimes that happens. I don't think you saw an example of it in the prep work, but I can make a constructor that calls another constructor, right? So if I have a constructor that calls another constructor, that second one could be possibly marked as private. I don't want people to use that one, but I'm going to use it for my own purposes. That can happen, but for the most part, I agree with you. Constructors should be public because we want people to make these objects and use these objects. So the next thing I need to type here is static. Just course, yeah. I actually don't know if constructors can be marked static or not. I'm trying to think about what that would even imply. I've never thought about it before. I don't know. I honestly have never crossed my mind. I don't think I've ever seen a static constructor. Pretty confident in saying that. So if it is possible, I think you're not going to see it very often, if ever. All right, cool. And so then the next thing that we need to do is decide what our parameters are going to be. So the role of a constructor is what again? Initialize the fields. If you leave this class knowing one thing, gosh, I hope that's it, because I've said that I don't know how many times. Role of the constructor is to initialize the fields. And so there's two ways I can do that. I can initialize fields by passing in parameters, and I can initialize fields by just saying every single time you create an object, the field starts as this value. So we have to decide which of those two categories these fall into. The name is going to fall into which category, do we think? Parameter, okay. So string name. What about the number?
It could be generated, or it could be assigned, either.
Usually the number is chosen intelligently, because like 100 classes are meant for freshmen, 200, and somebody has to decide, right? This class is meant for a freshman, it's going to be 100 level. So I think they should be here. What about the roster? When I create a brand new course, how many students are on the roster? 0. Every time, right? Nobody on the roster. So that one I don't think needs to be passed in, right? It's a course number, so like LC101, right? CS101.
MA101.
Yeah. So then for the ones that have been passed in, those are pretty straightforward. I'm going to say this dot name equals name, this dot number equals number. But I'm not done yet, right? I still have to initialize this roster to be an empty list. So this dot roster equals what? New array list. Good. New array list bracket. Parentheses. I'm calling the array list constructor to make a brand new empty array list so that when I do eventually put students in this course, the array list is ready to accept them, right? There's one last thing I want to talk to you about, which is getters and setters. So I mentioned this earlier with the student class. Writing getters and setters is pretty tedious, and they often follow the same kind of template. So much so that a lot of tools, IntelliJ included, provide ways of creating getters and setters for you. So when you're first starting out, I like to have people write getters and setters at least a few times just to get the concepts through their brains, but after a while, you don't need to write them out every single time. I can't remember the last time that I wrote a getter and setter outside of class. I do it for class, right? Because I talk about stuff like that. But if I'm doing something outside of class, I'm just going to have the IDE do it for me. So the way to do that in IntelliJ is to go up to code and hit generate. And then you see it'll actually generate constructors for you. I don't like that. I don't know, maybe that's just a personal thing with me, but I like to have control over what my constructor is doing personally. But I can choose to generate just getters, just setters, or getters and setters. So I can select a getter and setter. And now I have to decide what I want the getters and setters for, right? Actually, I think I made a mistake. Well, no, I didn't. Getter and setter for name, is that good, bad? Good, all right. Getter and setter for number, is that good, bad? Good. Getter and setter for roster. Probably, this is the one I think you could argue about the most, right? Getter but not setter, I like that. I like getter but not setter. And so if that's the case, I would leave it unselected and go back and just have it generate a single getter, right? And so I'll go ahead and hit OK here, and you can see that, boom, there's my getter and setter for name and number. And then if I want to go back and just do a getter for the roster, I can go back and do that. Generate just a getter for the roster. You can see it doesn't even let me do name and number because I already did them. I already got them. So just a getter for a roster, and then it doesn't bother. Yeah, what's up? Yeah, so add a student. What does that sound like to you? That's a method. Yeah, that's a behavior, right? Student's going to add the course. Student's going to drop the course. In fact, that's what we're going to do on Monday. To be continued, ... I would not, no. I would not do that through a setter. When I say setter, it implies that I'm swapping out the entire variable, right? Not just modifying it a little bit, right? And so when I'm using an array list, it implies that I'm taking the array list that I had, throwing it in the garbage, and giving you a new array list in its place, which is not what happens when a student adds the course. It's a little bit different, but we'll do that on Monday. And so you'll notice that it generated them all as public by default. So, you know, if that's not what you want, you can always go back and change them to private as necessary, right? Which is the one thing that I don't like about generating things automatically, because people get lazy and then they don't go back and think about whether they should be marked private or not. Or sometimes people get extremely lazy and don't even think about whether they need both a getter and a setter. They just make getters and setters for everything and say, all right, that'll solve that problem, right? Not even thinking about whether creating getters and setters is even necessary for all of the fields. So don't do that. I mean, that's all I can say, right? I can't actually force you to sit down and think about it, but I really, really hope that you don't abuse that tool. I hope you think long and hard about which ones should have getters and setters, which ones should be marked public and private, and treat them accordingly. I'm sorry? Yeah, so in IntelliJ, I go up to the code menu and I select generate, and then it pops up with this little menu where I get to select what I want it to generate for me. Yep.
So on the ones that we set up, do we want to keep them all public?
That's a good question. Yeah. Does anybody think some of these should be marked private? I don't know. I'm open to arguments. I would say that having private getters is probably pretty rare. If you have a getter, it's almost always going to be marked as public. A private getter is really the same as what? Private field, this dot, right? Basically the same thing. So private getter doesn't really exist. It's really the setter. They can exist. I don't want to say they don't exist. They can exist, technically. Java's not going to stop you. Just don't see it very often. It's the setters that you really need to think about whether they should be public or private, right? So the question is, should set name and set number be marked as private or not? I'm agnostic in this fight, right? I'm open to arguments either way. I don't think either option would particularly bother me in this situation. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Maybe we don't know, right? And if that is the case, actually, then my argument would be mark them private for now, or don't even make them until you know that you need them, right? That might be the safest option. Don't even bother making them until you know for a fact that you need it, because you don't want to run the risk of somebody abusing something that you put in there and forgot about. That's a bad thing. Yeah?
So if you have a getter or setter, I understand that getters are essentially not common, right? But if you have a private setter, what's the point?
What's the point? Yeah, good question. So what's the point of even having a private setter? So the prep work touched on this a little bit. Setters may not always be as straightforward as take a value, replace the field, right? Sometimes there might be some validation, sometimes there might be some arithmetic involved, or some other kinds of manipulations that happens to those values before they get set. In which case, I cannot stop people from saying this dot and overriding a field, right? There's nothing that I can really do. Well, I can mark it as final, I guess, but that I don't know how that helps us here. I can at least strongly suggest that people use the setter to set things appropriately, go through the hoops. Yeah, inside of a class, yeah, use the setter. In fact, that's a good thing to be aware of, right? If you see a setter, you should use it. If I see that a setter exists, even if you're in the class, if I see that a setter exists, I should use it because it exists for a reason, right? Don't use this dot if a setter exists. Go through the property. Don't change the field directly if you don't have to. If a setter doesn't exist and you need to change the value, then by all means change the value, right? In fact, I think you could then make an argument that if these are truly marked as private and all they do is the default setter value, then I would actually buy the argument that they're not necessary. Yep, I would buy that. Absolutely. Great questions. Any other questions? That's all I had for you guys today. Any other questions before we wrap up? So you do have a studio which is more design. We're going to continue this actually on Monday. So take a look at the studio, and then you also have your next assignment posted, or it was posted maybe last week, I don't remember. So take some time to work on that as well. We'll regroup and talk about the studio at 8 o'clock. I'll see you then.